The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the July installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series. My name is Katie Guyek, and I'll be your moderator for the webinar today. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I want to share. First, we will be providing a copy of the presentation via email within 24 hours of the webinar ending, so please be sure to check the email you used to register. Also, we will be doing a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so please submit any questions you have in the question box anytime using the box on the right-hand side of your screen. Today's presentation is titled, Don't Leave Money on the Table, Strategies for Budgeting, Negotiating, and Collecting Clinical Trial Payments, and will be presented by Liz Christensen and Amanda Miller from PFS Clinical. Liz Christensen is a client engagement manager at PFS Clinical. In her current role, Liz maintains a strong and detailed understanding of the clinical trial setup process, providing expertise in numerous types of healthcare institutions. Specifically, she works to offer strategic operational guidance for clinical research clients with complex requirements. Some areas of focus include study budget development and negotiation, coverage analysis development, training and review, trial financial management, and CTMS utilization. Amanda Miller is the training manager at PFS Clinical. She has detailed clinical research experience providing expertise in administrative roles such as budget development and negotiation, coverage analysis development, coverage analysis quality assurance, and research billing review. She currently leads both the internal and client training programs at PFS Clinical, sharing her expertise with new analysts. Her work with a large array of research sites provides Amanda with a well-rounded perspective of clinical research and a comprehensive understanding of the administrative needs of clinical research sites. So I'm going to hand it over now to Liz and Amanda to kick off the presentation.
Muted.
Thanks, Katie. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today for our webinar session on budget negotiation strategy. My name is Liz Christensen, and I'm the Client Engagement Manager here at PFS Clinical. And I'm also here with my colleague, Amanda Miller, who, as Katie mentioned, is the company's training manager. First, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the perspective that we bring to this topic. So at PFS Clinical, our mission is to find administrative solutions for complex research problems and help our clients optimize efficiencies. We provide coverage analysis, budget building, and budget negotiation services to our clients, along with a slew of other services. So that means that we're negotiating and tracking payments every day. Today we're going to discuss best practices for trial budget building and negotiations with pharma, and both of those topics will make considerations to payment collections on the back end. The goals here are to ensure cost coverage for your site, eliminate headaches for your finance team, and come to agreements more quickly. So for the next hour, we'll specifically be talking about why internal budget building is so critical to the financial success of your institution's research program. From there, we'll discuss rate determinations. So we'll answer the question, what exactly is our bottom line? Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into payment term language, because a strong agreed upon budget really does little for us if we can't efficiently collect on the payments that were promised, or if the fine print or clauses tied to those fees really limit us from collecting them. So Amanda's going to highlight 4 of the most common and most detrimental payment term pitfalls that we see, and she'll suggest ways to reframe those and negotiate them. Then we're also going to plan to have a chunk of time at the end, so probably about 15 minutes or so, for questions. That being said, please jot down those questions and submit them through the portal, as Katie mentioned. We're happy to answer those. If when the time comes at the end of the session, if we run out of time, we're more than happy to answer those via email. So we'll have our information on that last slide, so feel free to reach out. So one question that we get all the time is, why would you spend extra time creating internal budgets when the sponsor has provided an itemized budget grid already, and that's the one that we're going to be negotiating off of? Isn't this just extra work for us? Well, for one, it's simply bad business to expect that someone else, especially when that someone is the person that you're negotiating against, is going to do a thorough job of breaking down your costs. Additionally, we need to keep in mind that the itemized budgets provided have to be standardized enough that they can be somewhat applicable to all the sites that are participating in this study, not just your site. So every detail that might be specific to your site is surely not going to be included in that grid. Perhaps your site's policy is that any time a pathology assessment is done, it has to be analyzed locally, even if those samples are going to be analyzed at a central laboratory as well. So that's an example of something that might be a cost to your site, but not necessarily a cost to the other sites that are participating in the study. So therefore, it's probably not going to be included in the sponsor's budget. An internal budget is also a really good tool for payment reconciliation on the back end. The sponsor budget template isn't going to allow you to break down certain expenses by the department or the person that those need to go to when you're receiving a lump sum from the sponsor. It also may provide a lot of details when certain fees are applicable. So your finance and your accounting teams are really going to thank you for having these types of details available in the internal budget when you can't have them in your sponsor budget. It's also really important to keep in mind that the internal budget can be built in a number of formats. So that might be Excel, that might be a CTMS system if that's something that you're utilizing. So it doesn't need to be as tedious of a process as what you might think. Now that being said, I got the question so frequently when I was implementing new clients, and I would always get a list of reasons, give the list of reasons that we discussed for why an internal budget is so important. But for some reason, that argument didn't always hit home with my clients. So I realized, okay, I need to give some really concrete examples to prove it. So I compared the number of items recognized in a supposedly comprehensive itemized budget grid from the sponsor with the number of billable items that were called out in the protocol to show what percentage of items the sponsor was actually budgeting for. So here's a summary of two case studies that I pulled. One is from an oncology protocol and one is from a device protocol. In the device study, the protocol listed 22 tests and procedures that could trigger a charge, but only 9 of those were represented in the sponsor budget. So they weren't successful in identifying a budget for about half of your study. Then in the oncology study, the protocol listed 60 tests and procedures that could trigger a charge, but only 22 of those were represented in the sponsor budget. So that's not even half. That's about 36% of the items were actually captured by the sponsor budget. That's not very good. Now, to address the excess work argument that I continuously got pushback on, the internal budget should be developed using the coverage analysis grid that should have already been built. So there really is no need to build a second grid. If you're using Excel, just copy and paste into a new tab. If you're using a CTMS system, any CTMS system out there is going to have that functionality to transition your coverage analysis into a budget. So there really shouldn't be a lot of excess work that's going into that. It should be a quick transition. So to summarize and really drive home our argument, the sponsored budgets do not contain all the billable items. If you rely on them, costs are going to be missed, and you're going to be in the red when thinking about your budget for a particular trial. Internal budgets offer guidance to your finance teams about payment triggers, ensuring that fees are actually being invoiced for, and it also allows lump payments to be dispersed appropriately during the reconciliation process. Now we're going to talk a little bit about fee schedule considerations. So there really are two methods that are most common for determining procedural pricing. One is a percentage of Medicare rates, and the other is a percentage of chargemaster rates. When first considering the approach, it's really important to understand that Medicare rates are, on average, approximately 75 to 80% of private insurance rates. That being said, we would recommend budgeting anywhere from 120% to about 300% of those Medicare rates. Now, private payers tend to use Medicare rates as a means to configure their own prices, and Medicare rates are publicly available, so that fact makes this a really workable option. Now, one thing to note is that appropriate percentages can vary by the service class. So, for instance, the percentage that you use for labs within your trial versus the percentage that you use for E&M codes might be much higher than the percentage that you're using for imaging services. It might be appropriate to take 300% of Medicare rates for a CBC that's happening within your study, but it probably wouldn't be appropriate to take 300% of chest x-ray or CT scan of the brain. Now, the next strategy is usually more prevalent for sites that actually have access to their chargemaster rates. Now, keep in mind that some sites or some clinical research offices don't actually have access to those chargemasters. So in that circumstance, the Medicare rates and doing a percentage off of the Medicare rates might be a better option. But if you do have access to your chargemaster, the second option is also a workable option. Now, this is indicative of a charge from the hospital directly to the research department, and it's typically a discount of the standard chargemaster rate. One other item to consider on this topic is that not all study-related activity may be happening at your location. So it's really critical to appreciate and incorporate the rates from other vendors or other applicable participants in a specific study. So make sure that you're reaching out to them to get those fee schedules on hand. So if something is happening in your trial, but it's not necessarily at your location, or you're outsourcing that to a different vendor, make sure that you have those fee schedules on file and that you're looking to that when you're building your budget. Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself, okay, how do we budget for things that aren't listed in the chargemaster or aren't listed on the Medicare fee schedule? Well, for things like the informed consent process and central lab processing and patient drug diary review, we'll want to consider the time that it takes each study member to complete that task and what their payout rates are. Now, the topic of physician compensation and compensation model strategy is one for another time. We can spend an entire hour going over that, and feel free to reach out to me directly if you'd like more information on that specific topic. I know it's been a hot one as of late. So that being said, for the budgeting purposes, we'll want to determine the appropriate hourly rate for our physician, as well as a time estimate for each one of the study items that he or she is participating in. And we'll want to take that same process and apply that to the work that the coordinators are doing, along with any of the other parties that we have working on this trial. So for instance, you might have a data manager that is going to be participating in study startup activity or activity as the patient goes through the study. You might also have a research IT team that you want to consider in the budgeting process too. So whomever is going to be touching on these study items, either at the beginning of the study or as the patients run through them, you'll want to be sure that they're being compensated and recognized in your study budget. So because a lot of our budgeting is going to depend on time estimates, it's really important to touch base with your study team if you aren't sure on what to budget for. Lastly, I do also want to point out some of the one-off considerations that you might want to make a list of, so you can remember to check and see if those are applicable for each of the studies that are coming in your pipeline. So one of those is room fees. Whether that's an inpatient room or an outpatient room, those fees can really add up and put you under if you forget to incorporate them, and they're not typically listed within the protocol or the sponsor budget. So it's something that you kind of have to consider on the back end and ask yourself if that's applicable for the study that you're looking at. Next is the pharmacy dispensing fees. Now, that's a department that's almost always involved in the study, but oftentimes they're forgotten when we're budgeting. So let's be sure to understand what the pharmacy dispensing rates are going to be for a study, and incorporate that into our budget. Also, any types of supplies or things that they're going to need as the patients are running through the study, let's make sure to budget for that as well. And finally, a switch to home care from the clinic is a common oversight that can truly affect your budget. So what about the other half of our budget? All that work that goes on behind the scenes that can't be truly linked to one patient. We need to budget for this too. So things like startup, IRB fees, IRB renewals, protocol amendments, SAEs, monitoring, record storage and archiving. I recommend that you truly invest some time with your department to determine what your expenses are in terms of these study milestones. Really take the time to understand what those costs are and who's being involved in each one of these activities. Then make a standardized fee schedule that you can provide upfront to your sponsors, which will provide them with the details of what's included in these fees and even perhaps how that fee was calculated. You might check to see if the departments like the pharmacy department or the lab or the pathology department charge for their services, and if they have a fee schedule on file, that can help you tailor this research-specific fee schedule. Be sure to create this research fee schedule on an official letterhead template. So this will make it look much more official, and it will really help you argue your case during the negotiation process. Now, tips for negotiating these fees. Pick your battles. I would recommend creating kind of tiers of importance. So you might have one list of fees that are essentially non-negotiable. We're not going to pursue this study if you can't provide us with fee number one. Then you might have a second tier. And those you might keep in the budget, but you can lower those. You can come down from your standard rates and still be able to participate in the study. And then you might have one lower tier that says, okay, we can agree to forego these fees altogether and still participate in the study if it really comes to that point during the negotiation process. So when you're negotiating, it's just not reasonable to expect that all of these fees are going to be covered every single time. So you should be able to give up at least a few. And having a set list of tiers beforehand will really guide whomever it is that is doing the negotiation, and it'll speed things along too. So if you can If you can set those priorities ahead of time, we really recommend doing that. It's going to save you a lot of time on the back end.
Okay, so now that Liz has talked about the importance of an internal budget and making sure you're appropriately covering your costs and actually accounting for all of your costs, I'm going to talk a little bit about payment terms. So Liz mentioned this earlier, that you can have a really great and really thorough budget, but without carefully reviewing your payment terms and reading your fine print, your site might be left behind with budget gaps. You could have major payment delays, or you can leave your accounting team with conditions for payment that are nearly impossible to collect. Sometimes they're actually impossible for the site and the sponsor to verify the information they need to make the payments. And so we're going to go through some tips on how to keep these simple and make them very user-friendly for both you and the sponsor, because one thing to keep in mind with payment terms is that they do have to be used by both parties, so both parties need to have a solid understanding of what they actually mean and what it's going to take to be able to make and receive that payment. So one of the big things to look out for with payment terms is that it's actually defined when you'll be paid. So you can have a great budget, you can have accounted for every possible cost, but then if it never says when you're going to be paid, that's going to lead to issues later. So we find a lot of situations or examples where when you actually dive into the payment schedule, they're really muddy as far as when you'll actually be paid. They might say you will be paid, but they won't actually give you the schedule. So for example, it might say something like you'll be paid within 30 days at the end of the quarter after the CRF is submitted and monitored. So it sounds great. It sounds like 30 days, but then when we start to read into it, we start to question, well, wait, when is that data being monitored? Because that's probably not within the same 30 days. And so we'll dive into more examples in a couple minutes to go through how to avoid creating situations like that. And those types of payment terms are also pretty complicated. So it's really important for the payment terms to be as simple as possible and very user-friendly. So they're often negotiated by a legal team, but then they're used by accountants. And there are two kind of different mindsets with that. So we want to make them user-friendly and more, I guess, geared towards a financial user instead of trying to argue them on more of a theoretical level. They have to be interpreted and verified by the site and the sponsor payment teams later. So it's important that both you as a site and the sponsor, the person you're negotiating with as well, have an understanding of what the payment conditions and triggers are. And so sometimes it's easy to overlook, we're thinking about it from the site perspective, but then when you think about it from the sponsor side and they have to verify that information, they might not have a way to actually verify that. So in theory, it sounds great, but in practice, it's going to lead to delays as they try to figure out if they have enough information to see if you're really owed that payment. It's also very easy to make what we like to call fancy payment terms that work really well on paper. They sound really nice, but they don't actually translate into accounting practice very well or the ability to collect the payments. So we prefer to negotiate payment terms that are as simple as possible and as straight to the point. And sometimes payment terms can be wordy, and this takes some time and effort to get them simplified. So we came up with 4 tips of the most common things that we see and the most common pitfalls that we see with payment terms and not being able to collect payments or leaving payment collections potentially very open-ended as far as timing goes. So the first one is to make sure that your payment terms have both a payment trigger and a payment timeline. So there are a handful of different payment triggers that you might come across in payment terms. Ideally, payments for patient visits are paid when data is entered into the CRF. This payment trigger is fairly simple. It has to be done by the site anyway as part of conducting the clinical trial. It typically has to be done timely, and it's easily verified by the site and the sponsor. In practice, it's very fair for both parties. Less ideal payment terms are related to entering the data in the CRF and monitoring the data. Depending on the frequency of monitoring, this payment trigger can lead to a lot of delays in the payment process. If monitor visits get rescheduled or canceled, your payment timing can get pushed back with that as well, or your payment schedules can get thrown off. If the sponsor is insistent on having payments be tied to data monitored, we really recommend getting that monitoring schedule defined and working with it to make sure it's actually at a frequency where it'll make sense financially as well to have that payment term. And we've seen situations where it doesn't, and once the sponsor kind of looks at that schedule too, they realize, oh wait, they're never going to get paid, or it's going to be 6 months before they get paid on some of these studies. So that's something to be really careful about. Invoicing for patient visits isn't ideal. Invoicing is a perfectly acceptable payment term on optional procedures, admin fees, but for patient visits, that data entered in the CRF is ideal. As far as payment timeline goes, most sites we work with prefer monthly payments. So this typically is going to require heavy negotiating, unfortunately, but accounting is usually done on a monthly basis, so it only makes sense to collect your payments on a monthly basis as well for the visits. So if the sponsor doesn't approve monthly, we try to work in 15-day increments, so then 45 days, 60 days, and it goes on and on, but less ideal, least ideal is quarterly. That's a long time to wait for your payments. And then depending on how the reconciliation language reads and things like that, that can create some problems. We've even seen some payment terms where it's within 45 days of the end of the quarter. And at that point, that's just getting to be a huge delay in your payments. And it's going to lead to a skewed accounts receivable and create kind of an accounting mess as you go along. So that's something to look out for. So we have an example of a payment term, and I'm going to click through to put some of the information on the slides. So with this payment term, we found a handful of issues with it. So one of the things that we didn't like in this payment term is, as far as clearness goes, is timely leaves some room for interpretation. I'm sure you all know people who would define timely in a different way, and so the sponsor and the site could interpret that differently. It also has as determined by the sponsor and its reasonable discretion, so you don't really want your payments to be as determined by the sponsor and their reasonable discretion. That doesn't leave you as a site with a lot of flexibility, and it's hard to determine in practice. As far as the going back to the timely language for determining if you're actually owed a payment, your payment team might be asking themselves, did this count as timely data query resolution? Should we be looking for this payment? How do you track that? In here as well, we don't have within how many days we're going to be paid. All we know is we're going to be paid, but we don't know when at this point because it's based on completion and submission of case report forms, timely data query resolution, maintenance of study accountability logs, and all determined by the sponsor. And so there are a lot of activities that this payment would be tied to. And so to simplify this, we'd probably just try to make it based on completion and submission of case report forms. And we'd strike through that as determined by the sponsor and reasonable discretion. And if they insisted on keeping the other stuff in there, we'd try to put some timing and some more clear guidance in there. So we have another example of a less ideal payment term. So I'm going to click through to get all this on the slide. So the first issue that we see with this is most sites we work with would have is the quarterly payment schedule is not ideal, and then having to wait until the next financial quarter to reconcile the payments. And so this will lead to skewed financial reporting, especially if you have to submit any type of quarterly financial reports. So this is something that a lot of sites would have a lot of issues with. It's also dependent on data monitoring. That data monitoring schedule isn't defined in here. So depending on when that falls combined with the quarterly payment, you could be looking at over a 6-month delay in payments for this particular study, which would lead to some financial gaps. Depending on your site, it could also lead to cash flow problems as well. And then we don't really want to have to wait until a full quarter later to reconcile the payment if at all possible. And then will you actually be paid quarterly? Probably not in this scenario because you do have that monitoring layered on top of the quarterly payment. So for our next topic, we are moving into screen fails. And so screen fails are probably one of the more complicated payment terms, and they can be loaded with theory that just doesn't work in practice when it comes down to collecting the actual payments. So ideally, as a site, you should be paid for all screen fails and all screen fail work completed. So your coordinator and physician put a lot of time and effort into screening visits. As a site, you're doing lots of activities that are generating charges. So if you send the patient to get a chest x-ray, that's generating a charge. So it's only fair to be compensated for that work completed. So ideally with screen fails, we try to start with either the full screening visit dollar amount or something along the lines of all procedures performed for all screen fail patients. So that's kind of ideal where we're starting with, and we're going to go through some of the less ideal scenarios and how they can become messy or too loaded with theory to actually work in practice. So with screen fails, they get messy in a hurry, and so we see that ratios are a really common initial offer from sponsors for screen fail payments. So a ratio isn't ideal because at this point you're not actually being paid for all of the work that you're completing because chances are you don't have a perfect ratio where you're being paid for every single screen fail patient. So essentially your physicians and coordinators and your hospital staff could be doing work for free on screen fails, even though you're putting good faith that the patient would be able to enroll in the trial at this point. From the payment collection side, you might have to wait to collect the payment until a certain number of patients actually enroll, which is going to impact your accounts receivable. So depending on how fast you're enrolling in the study or how quickly you plan to enroll, this payment term could cause some issues as far as payment goes or potentially even cash flow. Another issue we see with ratios is with more specialized studies such as oncology, you might not enroll, say, more than 3 patients in the trial. If the sponsor budget payment terms come with a screen fail ratio of 1 screen fail per 4 patients enrolled, you're actually not going to be paid for any screen fails in that scenario. And so be really careful about the number of patients you actually plan to enroll, especially if you do studies in disease areas where you really don't enroll that many patients. And we've seen when this has come up in practice, the sponsors will say, oh, we just used our standard template and we didn't even catch that. So in some circumstances, they're not even trying to trick you into no screen fails. It's such a rare subtype of a disease that people kind of forget, oh, it's not going to be high enrolling, so that ratio has to be adjusted. One tip we have seen is sometimes if you flip the ratio, it'll get approved. So for example, if you flipped in the example I used 4 screen fails per 1 patient enrolled, that might be a little bit hopeful to get that ratio. But even if you had 2 screen fails per 1 patient enrolled, we have seen flipping the ratio be successful in practice. And then if you can't remove the ratio, once the study opens, it's really important to make sure that your payment team is kept up to date with enrollment numbers. So as soon as you hit that number, you can collect the payment for the screen fails. So another one to just avoid at all costs, if possible, are percentages, tiers, and caps. Percentages especially cause headaches. So the major reason for avoiding any of these is you're still not being paid for all of the work that you're actually completing as a site. Some of these are also extremely difficult to track in practice. So one thing with caps is we find that a lot of sponsors are approving language that states additional screen fails may be paid with written permission from the sponsor. And what we find and what we've seen our sites come back to us with is if they're enrolling really well on a study and the study is running smoothly at your site, when you hit that cap, you have a really good argument for getting additional screen fails. And if your site is doing a good job with the study, chances are that sponsor is going to approve additional screen fails as long as enrollment hasn't closed at that point. And so that can be kind of an easy backup safety net if you do have to have a cap in that budget. And we've seen a lot of our sites have success with that. In general, you want to avoid percentages and tiers. These are extremely hard to track in practice. And I know personally, I wouldn't want to be the one to figure this example out, but one that we've seen is the screen fail term is that the first 50% of patients will be paid 75% of the screening visit total. Then the next 25% of patients will be paid at 75% of the screening visit total. And when you think about your poor payments team that's going to have to figure that out, that's just a headache and a mess. And to figure out the percent of patients you're enrolling, you almost have to wait until you've enrolled all of your patients. So that's one where in paper it might seem like it would work, but in practice it's just a huge pain. And so we have some examples here. So to illustrate the percentage issue, we found a payment term from a budget, and it basically says that you're going to be paid at a screen fail percentage of 30%. Just reading this payment term alone with no context, we don't really know 30% of what. If it's 30% of patients enrolled, then you have to wait until enrollment is complete to determine that number of screen fails that can be invoiced. So depending on how long that enrollment period is at your site, that can lead to some major payment delays. Although most of this is not ideal, one thing we did like in here is it says additional screen fails may be submitted for sponsor consideration. So there's one little tidbit of good information in here that also seems to be a clue that, you know, they're definitely not paying 100% of screen fails. So another payment term that we find most sites we work with have a strong preference for is the check versus electronic payment. Most of the accounting teams, when you do talk to them at a site, do have a preference. And so if it's something where you've never asked, if you're negotiating payment terms and you've never asked your accounting team, do you actually have a preference for paper or electronic payments? It's something we would really recommend asking. It can save a lot of headaches later for those teams. And so it's reasonable to try and negotiate your site's preference in the payment terms. You aren't guaranteed you're going to get the preference every time depending on how the sponsor has the payment set up for the study, but it's worth trying. We find that we do have sites that are able to get their preference, and if you don't ask, you're never going to get that. And so your payment team will be very grateful later if you can get them their preference. So another simple tip that we've seen that leads to more efficient processing later and is fairly easy to get through in negotiations is to write into your payment terms that the PI last name and protocol number be included in the payment details. So if you're a site with multiple studies open with the same sponsor or multiple studies with the same PI, this can be really helpful information when you receive payments. And in our experience, this has been fairly easy to go through. Whether it happens all the time or not in practice is another story, but at least it's there, and we know that we've had sites that this is a requirement in every payment term that they do. And again, the team managing these payments will be very thankful for this later when they're processing payments. Another thing that may seem obvious, but can lead to some headaches later as well, is double check that your payee information is correct and matches the W-9. Where this can become a problem is in large health systems where you have multiple locations conducting research and they don't fall under the same business entity. And so you want to make sure that the payee information matches the business entity where the study is taking place, or whatever your standard process is when those situations occur. But it's something that can be easily overlooked. So everyone's favorite topic of holdback is another area where you can lead to a significant loss of working capital over the course of the study. It leads to extra accounting time and effort as well. So studies with high per patient budgets, that will be high enrollment or expected to be high enrollment, and high holdback can have a really significant impact on accounts receivable and cash flow over the course of the study. And so really the maximum holdback you should ever accept is 10%. But in studies with longer follow-up periods, you want to try for lower than 10% because you don't want to be waiting. If the study is a 10-year follow-up, you don't want to wait 10 years for 10% of your payments. That just is really going to lead to some skewed accounting. When we brought this example up at conferences, people will comment, we can guarantee you the same payment team will not be working on that study in 10 years and may not even realize that there's still money to be collected on that particular protocol. So it's something to look out for. And so to illustrate the impact that holdback can have on a study, we came up with a couple case studies of protocols where we had seen a sponsor budget initial holdback come in at 20%, and where they were studies where they had a pretty major impact. And so in the oncology example, the patient is in the study for up to 15 years total. The total per patient for one patient was $177,202, and they were going to, the expected enrollment based on the contract numbers was 9 patients. And so this adds up really quickly, and by reducing holdback into the 5 to 10% range, you can see based on the chart what a major impact that has on the study. That's over $200,000 more in working capital that you can have available by reducing that holdback percent, especially if you can get it down to 5%, because that's a 15-year study, and that's a long time to be waiting for payments. And I think when you're negotiating, you can argue with the sponsor too, do you really want to be managing the accounting on your end for this as well for that many years? On this particular example, I know we were able to get it down into that 5 to 10% range, and that's a big impact. And when you think about what you could do with $200,000 during that time period, that's pretty significant. So the next example is a non-oncology example. So we didn't want to think, oh, oncology studies just have bigger budgets. They will have a bigger impact on it. In even a study that's open for 4 years, it can have a pretty big impact. And so this was an Alzheimer's disease study. The patient was in the study up to 4 years, and the total per patient budget was $105,648. The site was expecting to enroll 7 patients. And so again, this was one where it came with holdback at 20%. And by reducing it into that 5 to 10% range, there was a pretty significant impact of cash coming to your site, to the site sooner. And so the site was able to receive almost $111,000 as the study was conducted versus waiting 4 years for that payment. And so that has a pretty significant impact. And again, $110,000 is a pretty big chunk of money, and that can lead to a lot of development of the research department. It could help fund extra staff members, which we know all research sites are always in need of. And so really watching that holdback can have a pretty big impact on your site's finances. And your accounting teams will also appreciate as well not having to keep looking for that balance to come in as that study closes. So Liz and I hope that you were able to take away a few tips for developing
Unmuted.
budget and see why it is worth the extra time and effort to develop that internal budget, and then some tips for payment terms as well to make sure that once you have that rock solid budget that you're actually able to fund it. So now we have time for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda and Liz, for that excellent presentation. So we'll move into the question and answer portion of today's presentation, and we do have a number of questions that came in, so that's great. I'm just going to run down the list here and read off the questions. So the first question that came in, do you have any recommendations for renegotiating budgets after the budget was approved?
Yeah, so this is something that can come up. So sometimes when you are reading through the protocol and you're working with your study teams on developing that internal budget, you think you have everything captured, and then that first patient comes in and something turns out it's taking 3 times as long as anyone was expecting, or there's some supply that you didn't realize you needed or wasn't apparent based on the initial information provided. You have an argument to go back to the sponsor, and what we find is renegotiating costs into your budget once the study opens actually goes pretty smoothly, because most of the time you have really solid evidence for why you need that fee in your budget to say the pharmacy didn't realize that the supply was going to cost X number of dollars when the study opened, but maybe there's a price change or something like that. And most of the time the sponsor is willing to do that, so it can be a fairly simple budget amendment.
Okay, next question. Because you don't know how many patients you will accrue, how do you account for this when budgeting?
So typically the budgets are based on 1 patient to start, and then they're multiplied out, so you would apply that same budget to each patient who enrolls. And so we'll see sponsors will sometimes provide you with an estimate of how many you'll enroll. So say it's $10,000 for 1 patient, and then they'll have a multiplier somewhere in the budget. We think you're going to enroll 7 patients, and so you can have up to $70,000.
And just to add to that response, I do think it's really important to talk with your study team, talk with your PI and your coordinators to really understand your patient population, because if you are looking at a budget in which you're slightly under your bottom line for 1 patient when you're negotiating with the sponsor, it's important to appreciate that that's going to be amplified if you have a large enrollment estimate versus if you have one budget that you're perhaps pretty far off, but it's really strategically important for your institution. It's also a good thing to understand, well, this might be less detrimental to us if we're really only expecting to enroll 1 or 2 patients. Maybe we can make this work. So I would recommend speaking with your physicians and your coordinators on the front end to understand what your patient population is and how that's going to be reflective in your budget.
Next question. Some sponsors give a single line item for each visit. Some don't even give that much detail. Even if they're given a breakdown by procedure, they don't seem to care. They just will raise the budget 10% and say they can't go any higher. Is there any creative ways that you have found that you can sort of break down that wall?
So at that point, if they're really just looking to increase a certain percentage of what their initial offer was, I would recommend providing them a really detailed breakdown from your end, considering, what items are related to CPT codes, and describe to them what your institution's strategy is for budgeting for those particular items. So providing them with the CPT codes that you're budgeting for, and listing out, perhaps you have a charge master rate, and that's going to be charged to the research institution regardless of what the sponsor is paying. So you don't want the research department in the hole or in the red from the hospital. So, really being transparent about the CPT code related items, and then also breaking down for them what your site's policy is on time and effort budgeting. So that might mean jumping on the phone and describing your physician reimbursement and with the sponsor to help them understand these are truly what our costs are. I think just being transparent about your policies and how you're going about building your budget, because for the most part, research institutions are not looking to be the money makers of the hospital. You're really just looking to cover your costs, and sometimes sponsors, really are new to the idea of research, or perhaps new to this specific sector of research, and so when they're building their budget, they're just not aware of what it actually takes on the side of the research site to perform that. So you might be one of the first institutions that they're negotiating against, and they've been given instructions by their senior leadership to say, okay, here's our cap. Unless they're provided with the very detailed rationale for why that's not going to work for you, they perhaps just don't have the information to understand why their offer isn't okay.
Okay, next question. We have experienced strong opposition from sponsors regarding monitoring fees. Can you provide examples on how we can successfully go about negotiating for those? And then another question that is similar to that asks if do you recommend matching the when negotiating fees, should we consider tailored fees for laboratory and site qualification visits before or after study start, and should this be separate from monitoring fees?
I would say yes, it should be separate from monitoring fees. In our experience, we haven't seen many sites that would negotiate those together. I would say monitoring fees, when Liz was talking about administrative fees earlier and she was kind of saying pick your battles, they're definitely one of the pick your battles fees. I think it's unreasonable to expect to get them in every single budget. I would say if you can get them 50% of the time, that's probably, you should be pretty happy with that. I mean, some budgets you're going to get them more often than others, or depending on the sponsor. we find we've tried to flip the way we ask for them. So if we start with an hourly rate, we'll try for a flat rate. Sometimes if you start with a flat rate, they would actually prefer an hourly rate. That's one where sometimes a lot of sites we work with are willing to reduce the fee as they go, and it's kind of anything is better than nothing. And so that's one where I think you do have to have some flexibility and some creativity with how you would approach negotiating those.
And to build off of that too, some sponsors require that the physician is there during the monitoring visits. Some don't require that, so having an understanding of what your specific sponsor is requiring can really provide leverage in your argument. So I think most of us are pretty familiar with the fact that the physician rates versus some of the other study team member rates are going to be much higher. And so if your physician truly is going to be involved in the monitoring process, make that known to the person that you are negotiating with, because that's going to be a higher expense to you.
We've also seen sites, I guess we haven't seen sites combine it with startup necessarily, but we've seen sites kind of combine it into annual renewals. So they take a relook at the annual renewal fee, and then they might bump that up a little to account for monitoring within that. But that would be something that you would have to do kind of across the research institution as a whole, and probably not on a study-specific level as much, because those annual renewals account for other things, and other departments are accounted into that as well.
Next two questions. How often do you suggest to invoice sponsors, and can you suggest or request a payment schedule if not received from the sponsor?
So as far as invoicing goes, that's something you want to determine in your payment terms. And so it's something that actually we see left out of payment terms pretty frequently. And so it's kind of up to the sponsor has a lot of freedom in when they will let you submit the invoices or how frequently they're going to pay them. So that's something that you should be looking to put a payment term and defining that in there.
What do you do when a sponsor representative is unresponsive?
Oh, this is a good one. I always like to start off my negotiation email. So the first time that I reach out to the sponsor, I will put in the subject line of the email what my goal date for completion is. So that way, if at some point the negotiation gets transferred to someone else, or they come back from vacation and they're scrolling through their emails and you're maybe at the bottom of the list, that will jump out to them to say, oh gosh, there's a goal date. For whatever the rationale is, there's a goal date. So this is kind of at the top of my mind. So that would be my strategy number one suggestion. If I don't get a response, at least letting me know that they're in receipt of my first email within probably 5 business days, I'll just jump on the phone and give them a call to see if there's someone that is more responsive via phone. And if you get to about a week and a half or 2 weeks where you're not getting a response, I would recommend searching for another contact. So if that means contacting your regulatory team, or perhaps your physician has a good relationship with someone else at this sponsor, reach out to someone else at that institution, one, to be sure that the person that you're supposed to be working with hasn't recently left the institution and no one has picked up your study, so you're just sitting in a non-existent box at this point, or perhaps your emails have been going to their trash, or something along those lines. That's happened a few times where they're a very responsive person, but they just simply haven't been getting your emails. They've gone directly to their junk mail for whatever reason. So just reaching out to someone else at the institution to kind of push that process along. And even if people don't pick up the phone, I think getting a phone call or getting a voicemail is always pushes home the sense of urgency. And so they might prefer to respond to you, and they might even respond to you via email once they see your voicemail. But just picking up the phone and calling will definitely speed the process along.
Next question. We have had difficulty negotiating to be reimbursed for subject screening activities. On some studies, we can spend multiple hours a week searching through patient charts that end up not enrolling in the study. Do you have recommendations on how to get this time reimbursed?
Yeah, so we would recommend, if it's a study where you know you're going to be doing a lot of pre-screening activity and chart reviews, you can build that into your budget as a flat fee. We've seen sponsors reimburse as an amount flat fee per month that you're doing that. We've seen them do a flat fee per patient. Sometimes they just accept a per study flat fee on it as well. So there are a lot of different methods that you can do to price that. But it's something that can be expected, and it's something the sponsor likes, that you're anticipating that, and that you are going to put some effort into that pre-screening and make sure you're trying to find just the right patients.
Next question. If your company uses any regulatory platform, do you find that it's easier to negotiate monitor fees?
We don't have experience with those right now, so we haven't seen that come up and play with negotiations with the sites we work with.
Okay. And then is it possible to request a PI oversight fee to cover time the PI spends signing documents or attending site initiation visits?
Yeah, that's absolutely appropriate. Typically with itemized budgets, you'll see that the sponsor will include something like a PI fee line. And if they don't, always feel free to add that in, because that's pretty industry standard, and that should be recognized, that the physician is taking time out of their day, out of seeing patients and doing their daily tasks, provide that oversight. Because at the end of the day, they really are responsible for what's happening at your site with that trial. So, of course, they're going to want to provide the best information to the sponsor as possible, and also, just looking out for their own interest. So, of course, they're going to take the time to review that type of information, and that's super interesting to the sponsor. So, that's absolutely appropriate. Oversight that is not really specifically linked to a patient, those might be things that you are incorporating into your startup fee request. So you're speaking with your physician on the front end to understand how much time they anticipate working on, not specific patient-related items, and then into consideration their specialties and their hourly rate, making sure that what you're asking for in terms of startup costs compensate for those efforts. All of that, absolutely.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. How do you handle a situation where you realize you didn't budget enough after the study opened?
So that's one where I think you can just go back to the sponsor, and I think you can provide justification to say, maybe your price changed, maybe you realize the activity is taking longer than you expected, and you have a pretty good argument and you do a budget amendment. We find a lot of times they get approved pretty quickly.
Okay, that wraps up our question and answer session for today. As a reminder, we're going to be sending out the slides, and Liz and Amanda's contact information is included on the slide. So if we didn't get a chance to answer one of your questions during the question and answer session, please feel free to reach out to them directly. I'm sure they would be happy to help you. So thank you everyone for attending the presentation today. We hope you found it interesting and informative. And a very big thanks to Amanda and Liz for presenting. And be sure to be on the lookout for the next installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series. Thank you, everyone.